Hi guys, before I commence, just again I'll just ask you to give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you like what you see. Alright, today I'm going to give a big shout out to a documentary, a doco drama I guess you'd call it if you want to be specific, because it has quite a bit of reenactment in the story. Now this particular documentary is called Becoming Bond, and it's about the least known of all the Bonds throughout the franchise, and that is George Lazenby, who happens to also be an Australian. Now I saw the film that he was in. It was called On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and I wasn't overly impressed. Admittedly, I was a Sean Connery fan, and of course Sean Connery was the only Bond that we knew of at that particular stage when Lazenby's film came out. So he's on a hiding to nothing as far as the audience is concerned, but apparently the film didn't do too badly at the box office. As a matter of fact, it did so well that the producer dangled a huge carrot in front of Lazenby, which was a 6-movie deal, which was incredible because I mean it was a huge franchise back then, and it would have been a plum roll for any actor. And the bizarre thing about and the reason that I wanted to watch this documentary is that I knew that George Lazenby had knocked back this deal, and I just found that astounding. And I wanted to see the backstory, find out why someone who basically was given everything when it came to that particular venture in life, being an actor. It's the dream role for an actor, and to pass that up, it just seems to defy all logic. But as you learn about George Lazenby's story, it becomes obvious that happenstance and George Lazenby are fellow travellers. He really did sort of lead a bit of a charmed life, and it wasn't just because he was lucky. He also made his own luck, to be fair to him. But it's a fascinating story, and it's a fascinating fact that he basically gave it all up as far as being, you know, the James Bond character. I mean, it's just extraordinary because apart from the notoriety, he was handed I think it was $1 million as a signing on bonus. It was the deal. So plus what he was going to earn in the other films. It's just amazing. And how could someone knock something like that back? Well, apparently they can. And look, to be honest, I didn't think much of George Lazenby before watching this particular doco drama. But I've got to say that I've warmed to the guy after watching it. I've got more respect for him, and I'm fascinated by him. And he seems to have some level of integrity that he's prepared to actually just say, "Stuff you! I'm not going to do any more of this." We had a small example of that in more recent times with Daniel Craig, who I thought was actually the best Bond I'd seen since Sean Connery. That was my own personal opinion. And he also turned his back on doing more films. So in a slightly less dramatic way, he followed down that track that George Lazenby did. But the thing is, George Lazenby only did one film. That was it. He wasn't an actor. He just simply lucked onto the whole thing. It was just quite, like I say, it's definitely worth seeing this documentary because it's an extraordinary story. To give you just like, without giving it away, basically, you know, George didn't really, he didn't have any education. He couldn't even get his intermediate certificate, which is 4th form in Australia. He was a battler, and he basically ended up being a car mechanic. And but from such humble beginnings, he actually somehow got himself into high society in Australia, and he was dating a very attractive lady whose father was extremely well connected, to the extent that he was actually he had the Prime Minister over, Robert Menzies, as his guest. So it's just an amazing story. And the same sort of thing happened when he went overseas and he became a male model, and he's a good-looking guy, and that's fair enough. He had what was needed, but he actually, because of doing his modelling, of course, he met the right people, and he got a chance to be seen by the casting person for the Bond film. Although he had to force the issue, and it didn't just fall into his lap, to be fair. It was a fair bit involved in getting to that position, but it's a fascinating story. And not only do we have the dramatisation of the young George Lazenby, because George himself now is 79-year-old, so he's getting on a bit, and he's he's grandfather material basically, but he's interviewed throughout the film as well, and he comes across as being quite a nice sort of guy, a reasonable guy. I didn't have a very positive image of him before this particular documentary, but I've got to say that I warmed to him after watching it. And, I think he's actually a guy who has quite a bit of integrity. He made a lot of money, obviously, as a male model. He was actually one of the top male models in Europe, so you can imagine he was pulling in some very good money. And of course, he had plenty of opportunities with the opposite sex, although they didn't seem to have really overly exploited that particular opportunity. At least that's what his story is. And he did actually have a torch for that girl that I mentioned to you that he met early on. Basically, that was his youthful crush that he continued on throughout his life. And even though he married another woman, he definitely seems to have had a real thing for her, which is endearing. It made me think, well, this is a real person. He's not just some sort of a sleazy guy who's just exploiting his position of power and money. Of course, he knocked back a lot of that because he could have been Bond, but he wasn't going to play the game. He was his own man, and I've got to respect him for that. He didn't put money and fame above everything else. His personal integrity was important. Other thing that's interesting about it is that I wasn't aware that the actor who actually played Bond had also had worked in America. An actor by the name of Josh Lawson, who actually appeared in the lead role of the Paul Hogan story that was on TV just recently in Australia. He played a bit of a larrikin in that, of course, playing Hogs, obviously he would. And he carried on with that sort of personality in this particular story because, George was a bit of a practical joker and a bit of a lad, and he certainly played that up. Josh played up that aspect of his character. I think I wasn't aware of, though, is that Josh, you would never pick it, but he actually plays the character Doug in House of Lies, which is, is a show that I actually watched quite a bit of. It comes out from the States and is quite a decent sort of a black comedy about corporate world, and he plays a totally different character. He plays a very nerdy sort of anal retentive type character there. So he's quite a good actor, Josh. So that was quite a revelation to me, and I had no idea it was the same person. His character, the way he portrays George, though, is interesting compared to the real George, because we also see archival footage around the time where he knocked back the Bond opportunity playing Bond, and that person, the actual George Lazenby, came across as a much quieter and introspective type of person than the way Josh Lawson had actually played him. He obviously had his moments, but he was actually quite. He learned to speak with a refined accent for the Bond role, and he was not a person that was chasing publicity or notoriety. He wasn't pushy at all. He seemed almost embarrassed to be interviewed. So there's quite an interesting contrast there. And of course, the filmmaker found it quite difficult to get hold of George to actually okay this particular project, because George had been burnt by the press over the years. You could imagine he would be, given the circumstances of what he's given up and what have you. They probably would have hounded him for a story years and years after the event. It'd be a hard thing to live down, presumably. So it takes a lot of guts, I imagine, to make a decision like that, because you just expected not to. You expected this is given to you on a platter, you've got to take it. And you can imagine how some of the actors who've been putting a lot of work into acting classes and what have you find out this Johnny-come-lately male model just waltzes in and gets this plum role. That would have caused a lot of dissent within the industry. It's a bitchy enough industry as it is, so I could just imagine the crap that went down. So, you know, look, it's a fascinating story, and I think it's very well done. Josh Greenbaum, another Josh, actually wrote and directed this particular documentary, and I think that Josh is in for a pretty bright career. He's only a young guy. I'm not sure if he's American or Canadian, but he's from the North America, and you hear him actually asking questions of George from time to time, so you can get his accent on the actual doco. But no, he does a great job, and he handles it with quite a bit of humour, and I think he gets the best out of George. And he had to cajole him over a number of lunch dates to actually get him to green light the project for him, because he was wary about doing anything like this. And luckily he said yes, and I'm so grateful, because it's actually been a bonus for George. He's come up very well out of it, so he should be very pleased at what's happened. And of course, Josh Greenbaum, this has got to be a feather in his cap. And remember that name. I think we're going to hear more from Josh in the future. So all in all, an extremely pleasurable viewing experience, and informative and funny, and ticks all the boxes as far as I'm concerned. It was a real winner. So big shout out for becoming Bond. I hope we see more from Josh in the future, this similar type of storylines. Hope you enjoyed this. Bye.